Good day, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the POSHpod, the pod where we talk about everything to do with the anti-sexual harassment law in India. Your co-hosts, Bishen Jeswant and Laxmi Char. I am a partner with Cyril Amarchand working in the employment law practice, so I regularly advise clients on issues dealing with the sexual harassment law. With me today, Laxmi Char, who is the co-founder at Parity Consulting, an organization that deals with everything to do with inclusion at the workplace, including prevention of sexual harassment. That's the two of us. Hopefully, we can add some value to you today. We've been discussing issues around POSH now. This is our second episode, but you will hear us today discussing specifically issues to do with whether the law protects only women, whether there are other genders covered by the law as well. So before we jump into it, Laxmi, you want to tell us a little bit about, we know broadly that the law does protect only women, right? Mm-hmm. And I will go into it in a little more detail on specifically what the law says and why it says what it does. But can you tell us your take a little bit on why do you think it is that the law protects only women from a cultural kind of standpoint?
Right. Thank you for giving me a soapbox on which I shall climb up and never climb down again. But why women only? And my personal theory. Sociologically, if we look at it, right, I mean, where does harassment occur? Forget about sexual harassment, but harassment of any kind. Harassment occurs when there is one party that feels more powerful than the other party. And this feeling is accepted by the party that feels less powerful. I mean, it sounds like very this thing, but the person who feels more powerful feels that they can get away with saying and doing things that perhaps they would not have been able to get away with the person who is equally as powerful as them, right? So if we look at global society, if we look at human society, right, and we say how is society segmented in this, using this lens, the lens of power, the least powerful or the most vulnerable section of any society is children, because 99% of the time a child is less powerful than an adult in a particular situation. So if you look at the way that India has also followed that path, the first law that talked about protecting elements of Indian society against sexual harassment was in fact the law that today we know as POXO. Right, which really provides this protection against sexual offences performed against children. Then we say, okay, let's take a step back and see what is the next vulnerable segment by and large in a society. And it tends to be women. And there's a lot of research that's actually gone into that, right? So now we're seeing, okay, the POSH Act. I am hoping that while we are seeing this progression of protection, we know it's not inclusive as yet. The law is very clear, it protects women. I'm hoping that what this means is that protection against sexual harassment in India is going to be codified into law for all vulnerable populations. And for all the men out there who are asking, don't men get harassed? Of course men get harassed. Of course they do. Right? What the reality is that proportionately speaking, the number of men or the percentage of men who get harassed is significantly lower. So I'm hoping the act is, like I say, it's progressive, not yet inclusive, but the operating word being not yet. I'm hoping we're going to see something in that space.
From a legal perspective, just want to add to this. Now, the law is clear. The law says that only an aggrieved woman can file a complaint, and therefore excluding any other genders, right? But so let's also discuss what it covers so that everyone is clear. It covers a woman harassing a woman as well as a man harassing a woman.
Yes.
Right? Both of that is covered because it covers all aggrieved women. Doesn't say aggrieved by whom. You can be aggrieved by a man or aggrieved by a woman.
Yes.
One. Two, it obviously covers, in the first instance, only cis women who are designated female at birth, right? In the first instance. But there is some progress on that front as well. We've seen Delhi High Court case of, I think it's called Anamika, was Union of 2018 case, was the Union of India, where the court, not in a sexual harassment, the POSH Act situation, but sexual harassment under the IPC situation, allowed a complaint to be filed because the IPC also protects only women, right? The section 354A of the IPC also protects only women. But a transgender person was allowed to file a complaint and take it forward in that case because she identified as a woman.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's a whole different story about is it fair for a transgender person to identify as a woman? Are the benefits that they get proportionate and appropriate? We won't delve into that today. But just assuming that the identification as a woman is on a good faith basis and is genuine and is real, it has to be said that the decision is progressive. Right? So arguably the act protects not only cis women but also trans women.
Yes.
Right. So that's where the extension is. And you spoke about the marginalized sections of society and those needing protection and will the men be protected. Fact is, all societies, all countries, as in when you identify sections of society that are less privileged, disadvantaged, you can see laws coming. We spoke about transgender persons. India now has a Transgender Protection Act from 2019.
Yes.
Right? India does from 2017, I think, have an HIV and AIDS Act, because that's another section of society who were being disadvantaged. So the changes will come. As in when we feel that there is a need for disadvantaged sections to be protected, the change will come. So, but before the change comes, companies also want to bring that change, right?
Yeah.
So, in your experience from dealing with so many companies on their ICs, are you seeing gender-neutral policies?
So, yes. And now suddenly the answer is fortunately yes, right? Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing that willingness. And again, there are certain organizations that are ahead of the curve in this space. And primarily, we're seeing organizations that are in a position to borrow or adapt home office policies, especially if home office is in, EU or in the US or something like that, right? They're definitely bringing those policies in place. So we are seeing gender neutrality becoming an element of workplace culture, right? In a variety of ways, POSH being one. Interestingly, you spoke about Delhi High Court. We know Calcutta High Court, for example, has very specifically said this, the lesbian harassment, woman on woman, is very much covered by the POSH Act. And interestingly, for me, as a layperson, I look at aggrieved woman as a genderized term, and alleged perpetrator has no gender. Right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that there is a little bit of wiggle room over there. What is interesting, and this is where I'd love to hear your take, when an organization says, hey, we have a gender neutral policy in terms of protecting our employees against harassment, the POSH Act is very clear and says regardless of everything else that you have in place, you, organization, are mandated to have A, a POSH policy, and B, an internal committee which investigates this, right? How do you see the play between that? I mean, is it good that organizations are being told this? Is it better to subsume the POSH policy inside a gender neutral policy? Where do you see the value and perhaps even the consequences? Yeah, okay.
So I don't see a negative in having a gender neutral policy, but employers need to sensitize the employees about their expectations of having a gender neutral policy. The reason I say that is because the law protects only women, right? Which means the statutory protections that are given are only for the women. So while an employer may be benevolent and give benefits more than what the law prescribes, the employee must remember that this is a gesture on the part of the employer. And you won't get the benefits of the law. Now, what do I mean? Couple of benefits under the law. The IC, the internal committee, has the powers of a civil court, which means with respect to asking for evidence, with respect to calling witnesses to give testimony, they have the powers of a court. If you defy the IC, the consequences are similar to you defying a court.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But those benefits will not be available, those rights will not be available to the IC when they are dealing with a complaint from a man. Right? The gender neutral policy can say that a man can file a complaint to the IC as well, but the IC won't have those powers when it is dealing with a complaint by a man. So if someone refuses to come as a witness, someone refuses to give evidence, you won't be able to take them to task saying this is a violation of the orders of the court right? So you won't be able to do that. Plus I'll just add one more benefit which I think listeners will relate to is the appeal process. Under the Act, if you are not happy with the decision that your IC is given you, then you can go to your authority prescribed under the law, which is under the Standing Orders Act. There is an authority who can hear appeals from decisions of ICs.
Yeah.
So an aggrieved woman can do it, and and a respondent against whom the matters can do it. But an aggrieved man doesn't have this right. Right. So while an IC can pass an order in a matter relating to a complaint from an aggrieved man, he won't be able to appeal in the manner under the law. So these are the kind of benefits that will not be available to them.
So Bishen, what if an organization is thoughtful enough to understand this, right? And has excellent legal counsel from CAM.
Thanks for the plug.
And says, hey, we've thought about all of these things. We are going to include exactly what you said, right? We're going to include those elements into the contract of employment, whether it is called a letter of employment or, whatever is the terminology, right? But into that letter that every employee has to sign when they accept the job offer, right? And then say, okay, these are the service rules. And if you employee are found in breach of the service rules, then XYZ is going to be the consequence, right? It's a little bit of a, hey, let's reach around kind of thing. But is that something that organizations can explore if they're thinking of, we want to be truly gender neutral?
No, absolutely. You can, unless the law prohibits it, you can have contractual obligations on the employees to essentially, like you're saying, incentivize them to comply, right, with the law. But what is the worst an employer can do? Fire you?
Yes.
Right? You don't have any rights beyond that.
No.
So the consequences are less grave compared to someone who does not follow the orders of an IC in a matter where the complaint is by a woman. Because then you will be subject to the court's process, right? Essentially for not giving testimony, for not giving evidence, right? So it's a higher, greater consequence in matters where the IC has the powers of a civil court. What you're saying makes sense in terms of giving the employees incentive, and having incentive is better than not having incentive, sure. But the point I'm making is it doesn't reach the same standard.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that from an organization's perspective, as a legal entity, it's okay for me to be more liberal than the law. I mean, in the sense to add more this thing, but I have to meet the legal minimum. And from a POSH perspective, the specifics of creating an internal committee, making sure that they know what their responsibilities and powers are, clarifying to all of the employees that, hey, listen, we have this kind of a policy and you are mandatorily covered by it. So all of that good stuff that the POSH Act tells us, we're saying that every employer who's covered by the Act, right? 10 people and more, and we've got certain criteria in place over there. What if, right? An organization says, look, we've got all of this, and we know that the POSH Act talks about no anonymous complaints. We, the organization, do have a whistleblower policy or whatever anonymous tips policy, and somewhere while that anonymous tip is being investigated or something like that, let's say it's the HR grievance redressal mechanism that is investigating it, right? And they realize that they actually have enough material in their investigation for a valid POSH complaint to be made. In that case, how is there a responsibility the HR has that they come up to say, let's say they come up to me and say, hey, Laxmi, you know what, we were investigating this anonymous complaint and we've come to know, about the circumstance of X and Y and Z. So if you want to raise an IC, if you want to raise a complaint with the IC, then, you have the ability to do it. Or do they raise the complaint on my behalf? I mean, how does that play out? Because they've come to know now.
Yeah. So under this Act, nobody can raise a complaint on your behalf without your consent, right? That much is clear. And it's also the case that you don't want to involve a woman in a sexual harassment proceeding without her consent, right? You don't want to force her into a proceeding. So there is And there is no obligation on the employer to initiate proceedings when you come across certain information.
Okay.
But since in this fact situation, the information is there with the employer, it seems in bad faith to just sit on it, right? And so the good practice here would be to approach the woman with the evidence that is available with you. Ensure you're clarifying, conveying that this is in good faith and this is confidential, and unless you want to take this forward, it won't go forward. And ask them if they want to file a complaint. If the answer is yes, then you ask them to take on record a complaint, and there is a process in the Act. Even if a woman wants assistance with filing a complaint, you can provide that assistance and all of that to put that record complaint down in writing, and then the regular process will follow from there. But there's certainly no obligation to initiate that by yourself.
So it's interesting, right? Because I'm coming back to where we started. We started with why does the Act protect only women? And then, now we're looking at this and saying that, it is possible that the organization has identified a woman who is entitled to protection, right? But chooses not to protect herself, right? So in a situation like that, you talked about the employer does not have the obligation to raise the complaint, right? But what happens if the employer does not in fact raise the complaint, and then the situation escalates in terms of maybe more women being targeted by this person, or again going back to where we've talked about earlier, which is the cultural stigma of women not wanting to be associated with being and I'm using this term advisedly, right? Being a victim of sexual harassment. I don't want people to know about it. I would prefer to pretend it didn't happen and I ignore it. And yet the Act is very clear that I as a woman, I'm protected by it, right? Isn't there a kind of dissonance over there?
See, no, I think the Act clearly says that the complaint has to be in writing. Complaint has to be from the aggrieved woman, right? There is no scope here to impose the complaint on her. I just don't see a way in which that will ever be viewed as fair by any court who's analyzing the situation either. And sure, I get the point where you're coming from, that there may be something that happens today which you come across in terms of information that you don't act on, which becomes an issue in the future. But you have no obligation to act. And when you have no obligation to act, apart from feeling like you have morally done the wrong thing, there is no legal non-compliance that you have done. Right? Okay. So if you have an anonymous complaint with you, or if you come across information that you think is not right, you can address that outside of the POSH process, right? You don't have to follow the POSH process to deal with an issue, right? The POSH process must be followed when a complaint is raised in the manner set out under the Act by an aggrieved woman. But nothing prevents an employer from making his workplace safer. So if you look at the POSH Act, Section 19, with all of those duties of an employer, there are duties in there to sensitize employees, right? There are duties in there to prevent sexual harassment from happening. The preamble to the Act also talks about prevention. It's in the name as well, prevention. So sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that the point of the POSH Act is to deal with sexual harassment complaints. It's not. Right? It's to prevent it as well. And we don't need a complaint for that. Right? And I think that's for all ICs to also, and that's part of the reason why it's like a tidbit, why the name of the committee is changed from Internal Complaints Committee to a few years back it became Internal Committee. Because it's not a complaints committee. It's not just a complaints committee. It's more than that. And so for all of the things that you are saying, the IC does have the powers to take action, and they should. And from the IC's perspective, to your point, right, getting involved with prevention and prohibition rather than waiting for a redressal, right, which is what the Act calls out, I think is useful for the organization culture as a whole and for every individual employee as such, right? So let me take you back to where we started this conversation, and we talked about, cis-het women and, non-cis-het women, right? So, given what we are seeing with not just the POSH Act, but also some other judicial pronouncements from the bench or even comments in the press and stuff,
Do you think that my hope, which is we are progressing in this space, that we're going to see perhaps an evolution of the maybe the POSH Act itself, or that in some way the judiciary is interpreting what they have, the act in the way it is, keeping in mind the current social changes and transformation?
I'm understanding your question to be whether the POSH Act will cover other genders and widen its scope in the future, and whether I think that will happen.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
Do you see that trend in the judiciary?
One, I don't think it's necessary, and I'll tell you why. Because it actually takes from what you are saying, right? From the very beginning, the issue is widespread patriarchy in India, the world, right? In the workplace, majority of people are men. Clearly, the segment of the population that needs protecting is women, and therefore the POSH Act makes sense. And when there are sections of society that need protection, we've seen the HIV Act, we have seen the Transgender Act, they will come. And in most of these places, the people in power are unfortunately today men. So we can be sure that if a time comes when the men need protection, it will happen. I don't think we need to force it. It will happen organically, and probably before the time for it to happen organically comes itself, it will happen. So we definitely don't need to push it. It will happen if it needs to happen.
All right.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you. And for anybody who's interested, go read up the UGC guidelines. They don't really apply to the workplace, but it's so interesting to see the trend in terms of how those guidelines have been interpreted and worded. And as always, Bishen,
do like, do subscribe, do write into our comments. We want to hear from you. The good, the bad, all of it.
thank you, everybody. Bye for now.